Hello, my name's Lisa Maria Muller. I'm Head of Research at the Chartered College of Teaching, and I'm delighted that you're joining us today for our joint Chartered College of Teaching and NALDIC webinar on supporting the linguistic and socio-emotional development of refugee and asylum-seeking students. This webinar will be recorded and made available on both the Chartered College and NALDIC websites, together with some accompanying resources within about one working week. I'm delighted to be joined here today by Professor Jo McIntyre and Amy Ashlee, whom I will introduce in a minute and then pass on to them to present their insights on supporting refugee and asylum-seeking students in schools. Jo McIntyre is Professor of Education at the University of Nottingham. Jo joined the School of Education in 2010 after a number of years teaching English in secondary schools. She's particularly interested in how, through the field of education, we can understand and improve the lives of those who are marginalised or disadvantaged by society. Jo has worked on a range of funded research projects, and her current work is located in the fields of teacher education and refugee education. Amy is a Senior Research Officer at Refugee Education UK, where she carries out research on refugee education in the UK and around the world. Amy is an experienced qualitative researcher with expertise in child and youth-centered research methods and approaches. She has managed and conducted research for UN agencies and international non-governmental organizations on children's rights and gender equality issues in a range of countries in Europe, Africa, and Asia. She completed her MA in International Child Studies at King's College London, where she focused on the intersection of psychosocial wellbeing and education for refugee children in the UK. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. And without further ado, I'll pass on to Jo, who will kick us off today.
Sorry about that delay. I was just trying to line the slides up there. Thank you very much for that introduction, Lisa Maria, and thank you to the Chartered College and to NALDIC for this invitation. The way in which we're going to work with you this evening is I'm going to start the presentation and talk a little bit about some of my research in this area, and then hand over to Amy, who's going to be talking about the ways in which Refugee Education UK are continuously working in this area, and particularly how we're trying to collaborate to work with teachers who are trying to find ways of working with new arrivals in their classrooms and in their schools. So I'll be talking about, or drawing upon, a book that I wrote in conjunction with my colleague Fran Abrams, which is based on case studies of 5 schools within England, which were sort of described to me as case studies of good practice for inclusion of refugee children. But it's not just about the work in this book particularly that I'll be talking about. I'm going to be drawing on a long-term collaboration I've had with colleagues in Sweden, in an area near Lund and Malmö, where they have worked extensively really with supporting new arrivals into Sweden. And so we've worked together with Swedish teachers and latterly with English teachers to co-construct a model of inclusive practice for refugee students in our schools. And I really want us to start thinking about not just particular individual tips or individual strategies for working with one child, but also to think about how maybe what we need to do is to shift towards thinking about a system-wide approach where we think differently about including new arrivals in our classrooms. And I'll be explaining a little bit more about why I think that's important as we move along. So firstly, I'm going to ask a question, which is kind of like a very important question, but what do we mean by refugee education? And what do we mean by refugee education in the UK? I've been doing some related work with my colleagues Elizabeth Walton and Karen Dixon in the School of Education at Nottingham, where we've been looking particularly at how images that we see all around us in the media really can shape our understanding of key concepts that we mean. And if we are to do a Google search, which is how most people get images, like today when we're doing a PowerPoint presentation, normally you'd go to Google Images and look for images. If you look at images of refugees as a search term, these are the kinds of things that you typically get. So here's an image of what is used quite often in the media to depict refugees as this huge mass of people all coming towards us. So often there's this kind of perception of refugees as a kind of threat to us and our ways of working, and there's a lot of people coming our way. Or alternatively, in the second image, we see portrayals of refugees who are desperately in need. And so in both cases, there's kind of an ask of us as what we often call the host society or the receiving society. That's if we look simply at refugees. I'm interested in refugee education. So before I get to refugee education, I need to think, well, what are images of education? And these are typically images of education that you see when you do a Google Images search. So they're either kind of these abstract notions of education being this kind of opening of knowledge. It's a tree of knowledge, which means it's not static. It means it's constantly growing and being added to. And you can see there's this kind of sense of movement, that education moves you on and moves you upwards and opens up potential. And the second image, I'm sorry, it's a bit blurry, but the second image is kind of a typical image that if you Google education of what I would say is a kind of fairly modern classroom educational setting. It may be adult learners, maybe younger learners, it's not quite clear, but definitely using lots of technology, very student-centered learning within a learning resource centre or library. So again, this idea of kind of, knowledge not being restricted, knowledge opening up. When you Google images of refugee education, these are typically the kind of images that you get. So these are kind of very teacher-centered, quite old-fashioned pedagogies. You get the sense that these are not very well resourced classroom contexts. There's a sense that the young people are having to copy from the board, so the teacher holds all the knowledge, and there's no evidence in these images of education opening things up. There's a very kind of restricted model of what the children are fed as part of their educational experience. Obviously, there's not a very diverse representation of races within these photographs. And if you were to say, where are these pictures taking place? I think we would argue they're taking place a long way away from the UK. So there's this idea that refugee education in the images is represented as happening at some distance from us. And really what we want to talk to you about is about how education for refugee children in the UK happens within mainstream educational contexts. Obviously, at the moment, we're thinking very much about what's happening in Europe and Ukraine, and I know a number of you on this in this webinar will be really thinking about how can you support Ukrainian students. But Ukrainian students are our most recent cohort of new arrivals. Before that, it was we saw a number of Afghan students joining our school communities, and before that, we saw a number of Syrian students joining our communities. And one of the problems that we have in schools, but also in the wider community, and especially with those who are supporting refugees, you almost get this notion of kind of a preferred refugee as public waves of sympathy happen with each crisis that emerges. And I think what we'd really like to get across is that refugee education isn't just about those children who are affected by these very high publicised global crises that are happening. There are a number of refugees who arrive in our country all the time. So who are the refugee students? The images that I'm now showing you are very different images from the ones that I found on the Google Images search. And they're all taken actually from a project I've been involved in, which is an arts-based project with new arrivals in the city in which I live, in Nottingham. And within Nottingham, just to give an example of one city, we are working with students from Eritrea, from Sudan, we're working with Kurdish refugee students, we're working with people from Kuwait, from Vietnam and from Pakistan, as well as from Syria and from Afghanistan and from Ukraine. We're working with young learners, so we're with preschool, we're working with primary age children, we're working with secondary age children. My particular research interest is in older secondary children, aged 15 to 19, who typically find it very difficult to access mainstream education, but also refugee learners are adult learners as well. So refugees as a group are not a homogenous group. They come from a range of places around the world, and they come with a range of prior educational experiences. And what we really hope to do today is to move us on from thinking about refugee crises and how we react to thinking about how we as a profession could just move the dialogue on a little bit, so that we're thinking about sustainable inclusive strategies which lead to inclusive practice for all new arrivals. And actually, I would argue that the model that I'm going to be talking about is actually an inclusive model for all children, not just for new arrivals. Now, this idea of thinking about this sustainable way of working with those who are most vulnerable in society is I think it appeals to our original rationale for wanting to become teachers, wanting to join this profession. As a teaching profession, we want to help. Here are just two examples that I took from Twitter, where individual teachers are reaching out for help, and then the responses are phenomenal. And the responses linked to useful resources, such as Refugee Education UK, who you'll be hearing from later this evening, but a whole range of other really helpful resources. And but as well as that, there was also a whole range of practical tips. So things like learn how to say hello in their language, offer to help them to start interacting with others in ways in which they're not reliant on language. So get them to play Connect 4 or to do sporting activities. Use IT, and there's lots of examples of IT programs that can help. Use picture books, such as a refugee story. Give them a book to write in when it's writing for pleasure time, and encourage them to write in their preferred language if they can do that. But most importantly, there was a comment in, I think it was the first tweet on there, where the teacher who was giving advice said, make sure the child is valued as themselves and that you're happy and that they know you're happy to have them in your classroom. These kinds of ways of thinking about the problem of refugee education move it on from seeing the individual child as a problem, but seeing this as we do in our profession. Here's a child in need, what can I do to help? And I think we can turn to each other. The answers lie within the profession. What I'm going to talk to you about isn't in my head, hasn't just come from me, it's come from working very closely with teachers who have lots of experience and ideas that they want to share. And there'll be people in this webinar who come from a range of different experiences. I know that I'm talking to school leaders, I know I'm talking to EAL specialists, I know I'm talking to very experienced teachers, I'm also talking to experienced teachers but who are new to working with refugee pupils, and I'm talking to teachers who are right at the beginning of their professional journey. And I want to introduce this model in the book, which is a co-constructed model with other practitioners, and it can be read at many levels. It's not just about one particular group of arrivals, it's about all new arrivals who, as I said, are not a homogenous group. And I hope that you'll agree its attractiveness actually lies in its apparent simplicity. And I hope that there are some things that you can take from tonight that you can start using and think in terms of your thinking tomorrow, in your work tomorrow. I want to start with a poem that I often use when I'm talking about how I'm thinking about refugee education. This is a poem by a young refugee, Amina Abu Karesh, and it was published in this book that I'm referencing here, but it's freely available on the website that's linked there below. And her poem is, from a land where people pick up I'm from Syria, from a land where people pick up a discarded piece of bread so that it does not get trampled on. From a place where a mother teaches her son not to step on an ant at the end of the day. From a place where a teenager hides his cigarette from his old brother out of respect. From a place where old ladies would water jasmine trees at dawn. From the neighbour's coffee in the morning. From after you aunt, as you wish uncle, with pleasure sister. From a place which endured, which waited, which is still waiting for relief. Syria. I will not write poetry for anyone else. Can anyone teach me how to make a homeland? Heartfelt thanks if you can. Heartiest thanks from the house sparrows, the apple trees of Syria, and yours, very sincerely, Amina Abu Karesh. I think that's just a wonderful poem. But what really appeals to me about this is the examples of things that she's missing when she's thinking about Syria are really ordinary things in everyday life. And Ravi Kohli, whose work is very influential in my thinking, he describes at the point at which a migrant makes the decision to leave and become a forced migrant, so an involuntary journey, they experience the death of ordinary life. And he argues that what they're then doing now is being continuously in the pursuit of resuming some sense of ordinary life. He traced young asylum seekers on their journeys through Europe, and as they were making their geographical transitions, he also noticed they were going through a range of maturational transitions and psychological transitions, and he articulates them as progressing through these sensations of safety and belonging and success. And although this looks like a linear process, it's not a linear process. These things are interlinked, and one thing can knock the other, so that one's safety feels threatened, and so you no longer feel like you belong and you no longer feel a success. I think this is a really interesting concept. I think it's a really helpful concept for us as we're thinking and teaching, but education is just in the success box. And I think, you know, we could probably find these concepts, and indeed we did with the people we work with in the schools in the book, find these concepts actually quite useful for helping us to think about what we already do or could do better when we're trying to include refugee children in our schools and in our individual classrooms. So if you strip everything else out and just think about safety, belonging and success, what is the role of education in resuming an ordinary life for young new arrivals? This became a normative operational basis for judging policies and practice for refugee education in the work that I did. I mentioned the work with Sweden, and there were there were lots of things we learned from this, but there were four key sort of takeaway messages from working with the Swedes. And one was about the importance of bilingualism. And I know, talking to a webinar co-hosted by NALDIC, this will just resonate. But rather than replacing first language, valuing it and maintaining it in some way. The importance of social and peer interactions, a holistic assessment of what the young person can already do and bring into your classrooms, and not treating new arrivals as a homogenous group. And these are the beginnings of an asset-based approach. We're not thinking about the young person in deficit terms, we're thinking about what they bring. And these underpin the thinking around safety, belonging and success that I worked on in the book. So just to start with safety, there's a lot in the literature around safety as a concept. And I think you'll probably recognise this for all children, actually. Some children, if they're feeling psychological distress or feeling that they're bullied, then they're going to feel that they're not safe in their school environment. That's especially, the idea of physical safety is especially important for young new arrivals who might have come through the experience of human trafficking. So having a physical safe place to be is incredibly important, but it's also incredibly important for all new arrivals and all kids to feel a sense of mental safety as well. One of the things that young people who arrive as asylum seekers are going through all the time is vulnerability, because their immigration status is constantly being assessed and reassessed. So they're constantly feeling unsafe and insecure. So how can we try and help those young people to begin to feel safe within our individual classrooms and schools? Here are just some quotations from the data that's reported in the book. So there's nothing here that's rocket science. You know, Amir said that school's mysterious to start with, and you have to get used to it. You have to learn how to adapt to it, and then you can start getting used to the rest. Victor says people need more help, more mental help. When they first come, they feel so alone. And my focus group of expert practitioners said they need routines and consistency. So many things are unpredictable for them, and things can change for them from day to day. So knowing they're safe here is important to them. There's also this sense about allowing them to feel they can enjoy being in the moment, but recognizing that for many kids, they're going to feel a sense of guilt because of what they've left behind. So they feel guilty if they catch themselves enjoying the moment. So that's just something to be aware of. And what's particularly interesting from Amy's quotation here is about making sure that the school space, the classroom space, is a safe space, a comforting place, a language conscious space where they can grow, make mistakes and be respected. So it's safe to make mistakes in their new context. And Fatima's quotation, I think, resonates. I don't know what's going to happen, but today I'm happy. And if we could make every child be able to say that at the end of their time with you in the classroom every single day, then I think we'd be well on our way to helping them to feel safe and included. So when we tried to define safety, we defined it as a multifaceted concept which permeates life for the child in and out of the educational setting. So it's a physical safe space. It's an environment, creating an environment in your classroom where trust is built, where they can experience new things in a safe environment, where they can talk if they want about their experiences, but they can also have the right to choose not to. Where there are consistent and explicit expectations about what life in an English classroom in a school is. We don't expect them just to absorb this. We're being quite explicit about it, but acknowledging they make mistakes, and to try and be their advocate, but encourage other peers to be their advocate, and for the senior leadership team to be their advocate as well. The second concept is belonging, and again, there's an awful lot in the literature about what belonging actually means. But I think one of the really important things is this idea that belonging for all of us is based on the webs of connection that we make. And if you've just arrived in a place and you're on your own, it's very difficult to start building those webs of connection. So how can we facilitate that? And I think it's also important to understand that belonging is a dynamic process. It shifts all the time. And one can feel a greater sense of belonging at one time and then feel less of the sense of belonging at other times. So In terms of my practitioners, what we came to was to agree that we were talking about social belonging, and this really fits with this kind of notion of Maslow, to building positive relationships first with themselves, feeling good about themselves, with their new peers, with the school communities, and then with the wider communities beyond. And again, there are some examples of the things that my participants said. That I think that last point in James's first quote there, they're not a kind of visitor, it's their city. So helping them to feel that wherever they are, the town, the city, the village that they're living in is theirs as well and can be theirs. Obviously, if they come with a faith, then it's finding ways to support and recognise and value that, and this commitment to valuing multilingualism, and this idea of trying to assess what they can do and what they can bring rather than what they lack when they're in our schools. One of the things that really became apparent was that belongingness is something that can be created. And one way of doing this is to think about place-based approaches. So that a place-based approach is where you do something meaningful in a place where you get to know that place better, but you kind of leave something behind in that place through the activity you've been involved in. And there were lots of examples of this, and they're in the book if you want to look at them. It's available online if you want to just dip into it. But the picture there is an example of a project that involved a tutor group which had quite a number of refugees join over the year, and the entire tutor group decided to do a planter. They found an old rowing boat which they repurposed, and that phrase at the bottom, "A up me duck," is what you'll hear on every Nottingham bus as you get on it. You're greeted by the driver with "A up me duck." So there is this group feeling that they're part of this kind of like colloquial language. So belonging is a multi-layered concept too. It's marked by signifiers of belonging that are quite easy in schools because we have uniforms, we have clubs, we have houses, we have tutor groups and so on. But it's also kind of more subtle than that, and it's about building these kind of like place-based relationships and helping the young people to feel that they can be part of a place and can contribute and they have something to offer. I'm not going to read everything on the slide, it's there for you to look back at if it's helpful. Success actually was one of the things that we really struggled with, because I think in education we always think of success as the output, the outcome at the end of our educational journey, and we decided that we needed to really reconceptualize this. So we started thinking about succeeding. So the idea is that what we're trying to do is help the new arrival to feel that they are succeeding on a daily basis or an hourly basis if they're moving from different classroom to different classroom. And there's lots of different ways in which one can experience a sense of succeeding. There are some examples there on the slide there. They're not always necessarily immediately to do with academic success. They're kind of, being able to problem solve, being able to show that you've contributed something. If you've got a life skill that you can show that you can do well. And although at the bottom of there we've got two quotations that are very different, Rihanna really wants to succeed in a way that can be recognised by the school, and that so she feels that she's giving something back to the school. She feels a sense of gratitude. Ali, I think, goes back a little bit to this concept of ordinariness and how to succeed for all of us, but especially for new arrivals, is to feel that one can be ordinary, and that's a real aspiration. So I just want a simple life, and that's it. I'll have a wife, a simple job, maybe a taxi driver, children. I'll have a small house here in, and then the name of the city that I was interviewing in. So succeeding again is a dynamic concept, but it's very much predicated on the young person feeling they can be authentic and have a positive sense of well-being, and that they can know how to make meaningful choices about whatever the next steps are for them, whether that's the next lesson or whether it's the next stage in their educational journey. If they're a secondary age student and they arrive towards the end of where our education system cuts off, understanding that in England there are opportunities for lifelong learning, but most importantly that they can begin to feel that they're valued and able to contribute to society. So all of this really is based on us all having a shared understanding of some key things, I think. I think it's an asset-based pedagogy, and we should be talking about that more broadly, which enables all of our students to realise their potential contributions. A positive attitude towards multilingualism, having a think about this placemaking and culturally responsive pedagogies is something that, can we do this in our own classrooms? and to think about how actually our responsibility is to educate future citizens about the causes of forced migration. So let's have a think about why we are continually seeing young people arriving from Eritrea and Sudan and Vietnam and so on. What are the push factors, and how can we educate so that we try and alleviate some of those? And I think it's really important that we have a recalibration and a reconceptualization of what we mean by education if we want to be truly inclusive, both within our schools and with society as a whole. Obviously, you know, we're at this webinar today when we know what's happening with a flight to Rwanda. I think that I think it's really important that schools model moral responsibility, and public good drives curriculum and pedagogy in schools. And this is based on a holistic, future-focused model of education for all of our learners. That's not necessarily just driven on test-based pedagogies and outcomes, which can exclude the newly arrived. So what does this mean for your practice? I think really, whether you're a school leader, whether you're responsible for support for refugee students across a whole trust, or whether you're an individual practitioner working with one or two new arrivals, I think you can think about, how do I create a sense of safety for this young person? I think you can think about, how can I try and think about activities, ways of working that will help them to feel a sense of belonging? And how can I make sure that they leave my room today, my school today, my trust today, feeling that in some way they've succeeded, even if it's in something that seems apparently quite small to me as an observer, but for them means that they recognise that somebody has valued them and can see their potential to contribute. So going back to this idea of an asset-based approach, if we want, and here's just names of students that I've worked with over time, if we want Hassan and others to emerge from schooling as intelligent, imaginative and linguistically talented, then we treat them as intelligent, imaginative and linguistically talented from the first day they arrive in school. Unfortunately, that's not my words of wisdom, that's Cummings, but I think it's a good point at which to end my part of the presentation. There's some resources which I think are going to be available in the chat or afterwards, which I think are particularly useful, from a whole range of different areas of support. But I'm going to hand over now to Amy.
I was on mute, sorry. Hi everyone, I'm Amy and I'm a Senior Research Officer at Refugee Education UK. And for my kind of time today, I'm just going to talk to you and introduce you to REUK and the work that we do. And then I'm going to be talking a bit on an initiative that we've worked with this year with the University of Nottingham to develop an evidence-based refugee education framework for schools. In light of the topic of this webinar, I'll focus in on two key considerations, language and wellbeing, kind of based on the evidence that we've seen and our work with refugees and asylum seekers since we've started as an organisation. Next slide, please, Jo. So just a bit about who we are. We're a UK-based charity that started over 10 years ago as a small volunteer-led organisation. And we've since grown into a national organisation that supports between 700 and 800 young people a year. As an organisation, we value this holistic view of refugee education that Jo has so well outlined. And everything we do is aimed at equipping young refugees to build positive futures by thriving in education. Next slide, please, Jo. So we, as an organisation, we run direct programmes that support refugee young people, and as I mentioned, between 700 to 800 a year. And we have a number of different programmes that I'll talk through briefly now, and more information about them is available on our website if of interest. Firstly is an educational mentoring programme, and this was our first programme when we started as an organisation. And it's a blend of tutoring and wellbeing support for refugee children and young people, often unaccompanied refugee and asylum-seeking young people, where we match volunteer mentors in a community with young refugees who are the mentees. And there's a focus both on kind of tutoring and academic support, English support, wellbeing, but also kind of a geographically focused local welcome for these young people. And we run this programme in London, the West Midlands, Oxford and Cambridge. We also have an education progression programme, and this responds to research and evidence that shows that kind of progression through the British education system becomes increasingly complex the further young people progress up through to further education and higher education. So responding to this, we have a national higher education helpline. We run educational pathway workshops, planning educational pathways for young people. And we also offer some one-to-one face-to-face advice sessions. We also have an educational wellbeing programme. And this is a smaller programme that provides more intensive one-to-one casework support for those young people who have perhaps more acute wellbeing needs. Perhaps those that are struggling to remain and thrive in education because of poor well-being. Just to emphasise, this isn't a direct therapeutic or mental health service provision, but instead kind of support work with an assets-based and resilience-based approach to help young people build their own psychosocial resources to move forward. And finally, our newest programme, which is still in its very early stages, is an education welcome programme. And as Jo mentioned, this has responded to the significant number of new arrivals we've seen from Afghanistan since last summer, and more recently from Ukraine. And this is all about providing information, advice and support for those families and children who arrive in the UK, understanding the British education system, the new kind of ways of learning, and we have at the moment an education welcome pack for newly arrived families, and we will be developing a national advice line at the primary, secondary and tertiary level. So that's just a very quick snapshot of our programmes, and again, please do go to our website to see a bit more about them, where we run them, and if there are any young people that may be able to access some of those programmes. But alongside this direct support, we also provide support for education institutions and professionals through evidence-informed training, resources and guidance, all informed by our research, international and national research on refugee education. Next slide, please, Jo. So I'm going to very quickly talk about our collaboration with the University of Nottingham. So kind of linked to the second part of our UK's work, which is the support for education institutions and professionals. We've been really delighted to work with the University of Nottingham this year to develop a framework, something which I interchangeably call the ladder of engagement, which is I think what we kind of internally call it. So if I mention that, it's the framework that we're providing for schools and colleges on supporting refugee students. And this framework will recognise the holistic model of refugee education as Jo presented, not just as an immediate short-term crisis and actions you can take immediately, but also as a long-term commitment. And the aim of this framework really is to translate the academic models of refugee education into some tangible actions that can be taken by individual teachers and institutions to support the refugee students in their classrooms. And this framework will form the basis of a teacher training module that happily we are hoping to work with chartered colleges on as well. So both of these things are still in development, and I'll encourage you towards the end, but if, as I'm presenting, you have any thoughts on the framework, on the teacher training module, things you think might be helpful, please do share them. I think there'll also be a feedback form at the end as well, but more information on that afterwards. We would really, really love to hear from you, particularly because I think Jo has mentioned that we know that we don't hold all the answers. The framework is based on research, evidence, our practice with schools and colleges over the past 10 years, existing literature, but we consistently are come across excellent practice that exists from schools and colleges. So we're really keen to hear from you as well in the shaping of this framework. Next slide, please. The first, thank you. So as I mentioned, the framework is informed by research and evidence, and particularly some research that we conducted for UNICEF UK in 2018 and 2020, looking at access to education and progression through education. It's also informed by our own internal monitoring of programmes, as well as existing literature and evidence and academic research. So it's comprised of 6 evidence-based streams. The first kind of consideration is access. So thinking through how refugee students can be supported to access a school in the first kind of instance. The second consideration is language, which I'll touch on in a bit more depth later, but which recognises the central and cross-cutting role that language plays in refugee children's educational experiences. The third is curriculum learning, so thinking through how refugee students can be supported to engage with a new curriculum, perhaps responding or learning, engaging with new learning processes, and realising their full potential. The fourth is wellbeing, and again, I'll touch on that later. The fifth is progression, recognising that challenges may emerge at key transition points for refugee students, particularly as they progress to further and higher education. So thinking through key considerations around that. And then the sixth is what we're currently calling school culture, which is kind of the broader steps, commitments, approaches or values that schools can put in place to welcome refugees and create a really inclusive environment to nurture their education. Second, please, Jo. As part of this framework as well, we recognise that schools are operating across a range of different levels. So there'll be actions and steps that can be taken at varying degrees based on resources, numbers of refugee students in your schools and other kind of considerations to make sure that the actions that are taken are kind of appropriate and contextual. And then finally, across all the actions, Jo, if you wouldn't mind just clicking, will be the three concepts that Jo has presented, making sure that all actions really contribute to creating safety, belonging, and kind of success and succeeding for refugee students in your classrooms. So I just finish off, I'm just going to share some kind of emerging kind of insights and just a bit of an overview of the kind of two key considerations in that framework, language and wellbeing. And I will end with kind of some resources and further resources for learning around that as well. So the research I mentioned that we did for UNICEF UK, language came out consistently as one of the most frequently reported barriers to accessing education and thriving in education, mentioned by young people themselves. This often relates to learning the language of a new environment, so in our case, learning English. But as Jo mentioned earlier around bilingualism, also key considerations around opportunities to learn or engage in their mother tongue. And external research suggests that this is really beneficial for refugee children's academic and socio-emotional learning. Language is not just a key consideration for refugee young people, but also those who arrive in families, a key consideration for their families. We find that parents who have language barriers and who are responsible for applying for school places for their children may struggle with navigating the first point of access, which is online application systems. And then in the longer term, language may be an issue for families if they're unable to feel that they can fully support their children's education or support their children with their homework, kind of expectations of parents and families more broadly. And just in terms of some of the ways that we have seen and that the evidence suggests that this might affect the three concepts that Jo's presented. So in terms of safety, language is key for helping refugee students feel safe in their schools and educational settings, including by promoting socio-emotional learning. Language is also a key consideration for that trust building process between students and teachers and school staff, which again is key for creating a safe environment and feelings of safety. Again, in terms of belonging, they affect the peer relationships that young people are able to make, their confidence in making friends with others. And again, kind of supporting and nurturing mother tongue can also help address their identity formation and their self-esteem. And in terms of success, without kind of proper support for language, refugee students may not be able or feel able to reach their full potential. So may face challenges with kind of supporting progression and achieving their goals and aspirations. Next slide, please. And so in the context of recognising that there's a very real challenge of kind of diminishing funding and resources for EAL, our framework aims to outline some of the kind of concrete steps that we can be taking as individual teachers and as institutions to support refugee students in terms of language. I'm going to just quickly up there are small steps. It won't be everything there. It's just a little snapshot of the sorts of things that may and that we have found have been helpful. I think Jo, in her tweet earlier, there was something around kind of subject-specific terms and vocabulary. And again, that's a small thing, kind of organising pre-lesson learning on subject-specific terms and vocabulary to support their engagement in that lesson. Organising language clubs, which not only supports English language or language acquisition, but also that sense of belonging and community and well-being. Facilitating buddy schemes for new arrivals, and where possible, pairing refugee students with another student who can speak their mother tongue. Celebrating diversity and displays throughout the school, celebrating languages and diversity as well. And then making external referrals, perhaps to English language focused mentoring, see if REUK's mentoring runs in your area, and then kind of conducting contextual EAL assessments. So I've included some resources for kind of further reading. The first is off the back of the UNICEF research we conducted. We produced some advice sheets aimed at education institutions, and I've included the link there, and there are some more kind of very practical tips and ideas. NALDIC have incredible resources along with the Bell Foundation. And something else in terms of sharing good practice and community is looking at the schools of sanctuary that might be in your area and reaching out to them to see how they are responding to new arrivals in their classrooms or refugee students, and kind of sharing ideas and nurturing that community of practice. And then briefly to touch on well-being. I think it's probably well known that refugee children are likely to have experienced adversity, the cause of their forced displacement from their countries of origin, but as well as experiencing kind of challenges in their new environment, including kind of discrimination, a loss of identity, separation from families and friends. And poor psychosocial well-being and mental health can affect refugee children's ability to access, remain and thrive